a struggle for Germany's soul. We are the Spy-Fi guys, and this is Traitors or Patriots. Welcome to the Spy-Fi guys, where we cover spy facts, spy fiction, and everything in between. I'm Christian.
And I'm Zach.
And today we have a very special microdot for you. We have an interview with the author of Traitors or Patriots, a story of the German anti-Nazi resistance, Louis Eltscher.
Yeah, and he is clearly more highbrow than anyone we have had so far, and probably ever will. We were clearly out of our depth talking to him.
But it's a great interview, and he was fascinating to talk to.
What is the book about, really briefly, before we get started?
So the book pretty much covers a lot of different attempts to assassinate Hitler, some of which we covered in our previous microdot, Countdown to Valkyrie, and of course some of the other events of Operation Valkyrie itself were covered in the movie Valkyrie. Not only does he cover these things, he goes into a deep dive history of every single person associated with these events, and so you get their history and their motivations and how and why they did everything they did do.
But don't worry, we don't go through all of them in the interview. We just talk about the general ideas. So yeah, this is a spicy interview. It gets political, it gets religious, it gets about modern day, past. Some hard-hitting questions are asked. I don't think they're going to put us on CNN, but I feel like we give a pretty good job for our first interview.
Without further ado, let's get to the interview. Well, thank you for joining us for a very special microdot episode of the Spy-Fi Guys. Today, we have author Louis R. Eltscher, and that would be the author of the book Traitors or Patriots. So welcome to the podcast, Louis.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Tell us a little bit about your book.
Okay. I used to, in addition to my regular work at the Rochester Institute of Technology, I used to teach in an adult education center. And most of my students were people they were all adults, of course, and very well versed. And in fact, I had some retirees from the University of Rochester in my classes on occasion. But they didn't know too much about modern history is for that, but especially German history. And I came to realize that there was a group of people who were really quite ignorant about the course of events in Germany, especially in the early 20th century, and of course Nazism. And that's what prompted me to write this book for a well-versed individual who really didn't know too much about modern European history, again, especially German history. So that's what prompted me to put this book together.
Okay, and actually, why don't you give us a little bit of your background as well? Just so you said you taught at Rochester.
Yes, I was born and raised in the United States in Pennsylvania. My paternal grandparents were German immigrants. My paternal grandfather came from Austria, and my paternal grandmother came from Bavaria.
Oh,
cool. My mother's family came over here quite early on. I have reason to believe that they were associated with the first. Her name was Korn, Korn. And there was someone named Korn, who two men, I believe, who came to the States with the first German settlers.
Oh, wow!
Country, so they go back quite a ways. But I have reason to believe that her family may have come from southwestern Germany, and it's interesting. I have had my what's the blood test you get for?
Like a 23andMe or Ancestry or one of those.
Right, one of those. And it turns out that I have some blood from the Ashkenazi Jews.
Oh.
Into Germany, well, quite early. I think I'm going to say the Middle Ages. I'm not certain of that, but I'm pretty sure it was the Middle Ages. So I have the blood of those ancestors, who, of course, were among the first German settlers in this part of Germany, in the western part of Germany. But the thing that really captured my interest here,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that I was a very young teenager in during the World War II,
Oh.
and I was getting all of this information, this anti-German and anti. There were the Germans, and then there were the Nazis. But
Mm-hmm.
in America, it was conflated. Every German was a Nazi, and I thought there's something
Right.
with my genes that would prompt me to follow a man like Adolf Hitler and his Nazis. And that's really what prompted me to begin the study of German history in a detailed sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if it weren't for the quirk of fate and circumstances, it could have been you fighting in the war.
Absolutely.
So I read your book, and I must say it was a really interesting read, and I really appreciated because you just go into a really deep dive background into not just all the different, the different resistance movements, but a detailed history of
Yes.
every single person who's in there. Like, so for me and Zach, we're mostly, well, for
Yeah.
me at least, I mostly know about, some of the resistance movements through movies like Valkyrie. So
Right.
and so seeing these names, which I recognize the names. Oh yes, these are people played by that character, but obviously they're real people. So getting their histories and your motivations really sort of made that even more real for me, just to get to know who these people are and why they decided to do what they did.
Well, that's one of the sources of my interest. In fact, the major source.
Hmm.
Just how did the German people react to the Nazis? Again, there was the propaganda, but then there's also truth. And I I wanted to write a fairly broad history of the period, which would include people both pro and con as far as the
Hmm.
Nazis are concerned. And I would like to think that I came up with a well balanced history of the period.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. Now, since I brought up the movie Valkyrie, have you seen it?
Yes, I'm trying to think. I've seen several, but yeah, I'm pretty sure I saw Valkyrie.
Yeah, that was the one with Tom Cruise as
Yeah,
Stauffenberg.
right, right.
What did you think of it?
I thought it was quite accurate.
Yeah.
It was very good.
So I actually wanted to jump in about that. We did a little bit of spy fact versus fiction for Valkyrie about Stauffenberg, and we used a book then called Countdown to Valkyrie by Nigel Jones. And something that we didn't discuss then that I was not aware of was that Stauffenberg actually didn't seem to mind the militarism of the Nazis so much. His motivations were more out of self-preservation for the country, and I was wondering if you might be able to shed some light on that.
Yes, well, I must say that there is the main source of militarism in German history is the Prussians, the Prussian state. And many of the opponents to the Nazis, I'm talking now about the top leadership, especially in the army. And I should comment on this, that the army was the only uh, instrument, I guess is a word, that had direct access to Hitler.
Hmm.
Mhm.
This was, of course, during the war years, and there was a very strong, very almost, well, I'm tempted to use the word violent, opposition to Hitler within the German army itself and within the leadership. And some of the names that were used, that were, I should say, not used, but were prominent in the anti-Nazi resistance movement within the army, these names go back to the days of Frederick the Great, back in the 16th century. So there was direct family ties to those who were adamantly opposed to Hitler. And of course, that gave the lie to the idea that there was this close partnership, if you will, between the old German nationalists and the militarists and the Nazis. The truth was that these men despised Hitler and the Nazis. Most of them did. The problem was that there weren't enough men in high places that were willing to act with the courage that was required to depose Hitler. There were about 3 or 4 men in the military who, for whatever reason, neglected, or I should say neglected, rejected the idea that they should become part of the movement. They were sympathetic to the Nazi movement, but they just didn't have the internal fortitude to step out and take an active role in the resistance movement. I could talk a lot more, but I could get into a lot of detail of the specifics of their attempts on Hitler's life. He claimed that there were some 42 attempts on his life. Whether that's true,
Wow.
we'll never know.
Mm-hmm.
But what we do know is that there were at least 3 times when the army came within almost, minutes, if you will, in deposing Hitler.
Yes, I remember reading that in the book. Like, so when I was reading it, and I'm trying to remember what the phrasing he used, but I think it was something like, attempt 1, attempt. And I was reading, I was like, wow, Valkyrie was the 4th attempt.
That's right.
That's crazy to me, because I guess in the movie they portray the 3rd attempt, which was the attempt. I forget I think was it Operation Flash, where they had the bottle of schnapps with explosives in it.
Yeah, that's the one. I think you're referring to the episode in which Hitler was obliged to make a trip to the Soviet Union during the war, and he had to talk to his generals specifically. Well, there were a couple of resistance people. It was there were 3 army groups in Russia and the Soviet Union during the war, and it was the third. The third group that was most active in the anti-Nazi movement, and they were able to conspire to put a bomb on the plane that was to carry Hitler back to Berlin.
Oh wow!
and they set the timing mechanism on it and everything. The plane took off. Well, they had about 2 hours wait or whatever. And I can't imagine what they must have gone through. Did anybody shoot this plane down? Did it explode? What happened? Well, what happened was, first of all, there were no Russian or Allied planes that attacked the plane. And secondly, the bomb had been placed in the cargo hold of the plane. And it turned out that the weather, the temperature was so low that the explosive device, the trigger for the explosion, wouldn't function.
Oh my gosh! Wow. When we covered Countdown to Valkyrie, my co-host Zach here was telling me about all the near misses that happened, and I think you talk about in your book too that like people like you say that no, he didn't have a supernatural sense about it but because he's just on so high alert. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he I believe he himself, if I remember correctly, he himself said that he was being guided by Providence.
Well, he would say that.
Some Providence.
So the ones that we talked about were Operation Flash, which we mentioned, an attempt to overthrow the government within the Wehrmacht. I learned how to pronounce it correctly, Christian.
Nice.
Good. Now. And then we also talked about Georg Elser, so I have some questions about him. But before we get to him, are there any other major attempts to kill Hitler that wasn't Valkyrie, Flash, Elser, or some kind of overthrow that you wanted to talk about?
Well, there was at the time of the Munich conference in 1938. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Of course, the negotiations were going on between the Nazis and France and Britain over the fate of Czechoslovakia. And it looked as if, at one point, Chamberlain was going to declare war on, or should say the British government was going to declare war on Germany. And the conspirators were prepared. They had a raiding party. A group was led by, again, a general and they intended, as soon as the declaration of war would be declared, they would strike right at the Bendlerstrasse, which was the German headquarters in Berlin, and they were prepared to kill Hitler right at that point.
Oh, wow.
But within 12 hours, the whole situation changed because Chamberlain and the British government and the French government decided to negotiate with Hitler and give him what he wanted. And so the whole thing fell apart.
Right. I remember reading about this in your book, and you mentioned that there's a question of, okay, even though that was going to happen, why didn't they just go through with it anyways? Why didn't the team that was supposed to take him out and take out, all of them just go for it?
Well, the problem with that is that you can't really have a truly united nation when you try to wipe out the leadership during wartime.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
That was the key to the whole thing, because as we well know, I'm sure you know this, that the German people themselves did not want to go to war. None of them wanted war. And when the war declaration was given, the response within Germany was underwhelming. They just accepted it as a kind of fatalism. And Hitler was watching a group from his headquarters. This again was in Berlin, and when the announcement was made, the group, or I should say, the population, was totally what's the word? Probably dismissive. There was no cheering at all. And Hitler, in his anger, turned away from the window, said, "How can I ever lead a nation like this to war?"
Wow.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that.
Lack of enthusiasm for the war.
So, Zach, do we want to talk about one of your favorite stories that you've heard about?
Yeah, I must have repeated the story like 5 different times about Eltscher almost killing Hitler, and I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about him.
Yes, he was a man who acted entirely on his own. He was so thoroughly disgusted with Hitler and his Nazis that he was determined to assassinate him if he could. And he came within 13 minutes of doing it. There was an annual celebration on the 8th and 9th of November, and this was commemorating Hitler's attempt to overthrow the Republican government in November of 1923. This was the beer hall putsch.
Mm-hmm.
And Elser worked after hours. He would come to the beer cellar, wait until everybody had left and the place was locked up, and then he'd go to work. And he hollowed out one of the main pillars of the building, of the ceiling, and he had access to explosive because he worked in a quarry, a stone quarry, and he set the bomb to go off at something like 9:15.
Mm-hmm.
And Hitler usually stayed over time after he would give his speech and fellowship with the alte Kämpfer, the old friends that he had, the old comrades, and he would stay there till even 10 o'clock or so. This particular night, he left precisely at 9 o'clock, and at 9:13, the bomb exploded.
Oh my gosh.
Changed the complete course of world history had that taken place. This was simply emblematic of the kinds of problems that the conspirators faced in dealing with Hitler. And of course, you have to remember, Hitler had a secret army and he had a secret police too. And they were constantly on these guys' tails. And, they couldn't really come up with anything definitive, but they suspected that there was something wrong. And it was within the intelligence, the Abwehr, which was the intelligence section of the Wehrmacht, the army. And that was a center of resistance within the army in trying to get rid of Hitler.
Yes, I remember reading in the book you talked about how when they caught Elser, they thought that they were like convinced that he was a part of a different conspiracy with the Brits.
Yes, that's true. And apparently what Hitler wanted to do was to keep Elser alive until the end of the war. And then after they, of course, won the war, they would execute Elser. He got executed anyway, but there was no military victory to celebrate on the part of the Nazis.
Yeah, it's sad. So I have a question.
Sure.
In the book, Countdown to Valkyrie, Elser was described as a weird person. Obviously, Nigel didn't phrase it quite like that. But as a weird person myself, I felt a lot of affinity with him. So how weird was he? Can you tell us?
Georg Elser. Yes. Well, what can I say? He was pretty much from my perspective. He was pretty much he was a bachelor. He may have been gay. I don't know, but I don't know that anybody. I can't recall ever having read that he was gay. But he was just a bachelor, and he was a craftsman of basically a carpenter, and he lived a very quiet life. But he developed this vicious hatred of the Nazis and Hitler in particular, and he determined that he would dispatch Hitler himself. And he came within 13 minutes of succeeding.
That gets me. Every time that I hear something like that, where it's just like it was just so close, if not for this one thing.
But the other thing that impresses me so about these conspirators is that they were men of deep moral conviction. And when excuse me for getting contemporary here, but when I take a look at what's going on in the United States of America today, I see a carbon copy of that.
Mm-hmm.
What's happened to the Republican Party. The people that put Hitler in power wanted to use him to serve their interests. He could get votes.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they cared about. And one man, after he was, of course, he was actually placed into office by Paul Hindenburg, the president of the Republic, and can't think of two others who were involved in the thing. They decided that they would give Hitler, Kurt von Schleicher, who was Minister of Defense, I believe, and then another one, Franz von Papen. Those were the three men who put him into office.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought that they would use him to get the votes, and then they'd get rid of him. Well, again, they didn't succeed in that. And they were, what can I say? They were just a bunch of lily-livered cowards, as far as I'm concerned.
So do you think of these various attempts, if they had killed Hitler, they would have been able to get the result they wanted, which was an end to the war or prevention of the war?
Well, that's a good question. I don't have an answer to that. My suspicion is that they would have had to surrender. Now, whether the United States and Britain would have agreed to this or not, I don't know. I suspect they would have.
Okay.
Basic surrender, I think they probably would. It's a good question. We'll never answer. Of course, the closer they got to the end, the more desperate the German position became, and I think the more they would have been to surrender.
The reason why I ask is a lot of these academic folks like to talk about history in terms of inevitabilities. I'm sure being an academic yourself, you've probably heard this.
Oh, yeah. I don't think anything is inevitable. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Because, like, for example, I remember someone was like, oh, the seeds of World War II were built at the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I.
I can't say that's wrong.
Well, I honestly think there is a lot of truth in that. Because the French, in particular, had this vicious hatred of Germany, and I should use the one personality. I can't think of his name. He was Premier of France, and he was from Alsace-Lorraine, and he hated the Germans because they had taken over Alsace-Lorraine in 1871, and he was insistent that the peace treaty be a very punitive peace settlement, and it was, and it only made things worse for the world. I just feel that, for me personally, I think the main point was the insistence that Germany become a republic.
Right, the Wehrmacht Republic.
Right. I honestly think that if the Treaty of Versailles had been more moderate and allowed Germany to keep a Kaiser, or maybe he wasn't the emperor, but he could be a king, as a kind of, what we have in Great Britain today, figurehead.
Right.
Keep that there, because I think that might have helped. But of course, we'll never know.
Right.
So again, I'm not about inevitability here. I'm just thinking of potential.
Sure.
So one of the things I really appreciate about the book, because I mean, German is such an interesting language, and people make jokes how they have literally a word for everything. But what I appreciated in your book was that you would use the word, like the actual German word, and then give us a translation of what the literal meaning was, so that we get an idea of, all right, it loses something in the translation, definitely, but just seeing the word and then having the translation right after that gives you at least some of the idea of the impact the word has.
Yes. Well, again, I approached the writing of this book. I was approaching an audience that, again, very possibly could be very well educated, but they don't know a word of German. I know a few words of German. I don't speak German. I know enough to get myself into trouble when I go to Germany. That was one of the things I wanted to do, was to try to make this a readable book for a non-German speaking audience.
I have another question, Christian. I don't want to ask too many.
Go for it.
I know that some of the early attempts thought about working with the Allies, and certainly there's plenty of movies where fictional Allied superheroes / super soldiers try to kill Hitler. So were there any Allied attempts that worked with Germans or otherwise that you know about?
There was an attempt made in 1940, something thereabouts, to try to. It was a German, again, I think it was a military officer, who came to the United States, and this may have even been before 39. It could have been 30, 37 or 38. I'd have to double check. I've written about it, but I've forgotten some of the details. He came to America to try to persuade the American government to support the resistance movement, and they didn't do it.
Oh, what? Before 39, so the U.S. wasn't even in the war yet, but still, that idea is just, when you think about what's going to happen, what would happen in the next few years, you just kind of wonder, how did you not even think about this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of the answer lies in the fact that they didn't know how bad it was really going to get.
Right, yeah. How could you?
Was something that I referred to before, and that's the anti-German feeling that prevailed in this country.
Of course.
After World War I.
Right.
It was always those damn Germans, Well, a 12 or 13-year-old kid with a 90% German heritage, all this stuff, you get the picture.
I can imagine that. I think one of our good friends, actually, I think I don't remember if I think it was post World War II, actually, her family changed her name so it sounded less German.
Oh, yes. I know that happened on occasions. Well, that didn't happen in my case. Take me as I am.
I understand that completely. Yeah, no, you shouldn't have to change, who you are and because of the sentiments of others. Yeah, definitely.
What's going on in this country today? Oh, don't get me off on that.
Well, as a history professor, Shirley, history repeats itself.
Sadly.
It repeats itself. Well, who was it? It was the American writer, he wrote Tom Sawyer.
Oh, Mark Twain? Yes.
Mark Twain. He said, history does not repeat itself. but it rhymes. And I
Right.
think that's a good way of putting it. I believe that every historical event is unique. People use the term parallel. This is parallel in history. I don't like that word parallel because, from my perspective at least, it tries to demonstrate that there's an exact similarity,
Hmm.
an exact instance. It's not. It's more than just a similarity. And I don't believe that. I believe that every historical event is unique because there was something that went on before them. And it's just different people and so on. But there's this rhyming tendency that you can see certain comparisons there are certain similarities in the course of history.
So I know that me and Zach have a favorite. Well, it was weird to say a favorite attempt, but our would be Georg Elser, and I really am fascinated by Operation Valkyrie. Do you have one that's your favorite one to read about or think about?
Well, I have to say, my hero of history
Hmm.
is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the clergyman.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very, very active in the resistance movement. And of course, he paid with his opposition with his life. But
Hmm.
he was a man of deep moral conviction. And of course, he was a clergyman. And as I read about this man, it just overwhelms me when I see how determined he was. He was among the very first people in the mid 1920s to take a stand against Hitler.
Oh wow!
And his stand became more pronounced as the years unfolded. So, yes, I have him. And
So what
also,
happened to him?
he was executed. He was
Oof.
arrested in January of 43, I believe it was, because there was a suspicion that he was involved in the resistance movement. So he was put into prison. But what's remarkable, from my perspective, what's remarkable is that he did much of his writing while he was in prison.
Oh wow!
And yeah, he's great. Oh, there were others also. There was Georg Elser.
Okay, so one of the things we talked about in Countdown to Valkyrie, Christian may remember this, and then they showed up on a recent episode of My Favorite Murder, is the White Rose, which were students that went around
Oh,
distributing
Yes.
pamphlets.
well, I have to tell you something personal about this.
Okay.
One of the members of the White Rose was a man by the name of Amalia Probst,
Okay.
Probst. One of the co-conspirators. There were the brother and sister,
Hmm.
Joel, and then one other man, and then Fritz Probst, who he was a student at the University of Munich. He was very active in the White Rose movement and was arrested and executed, of course.
Hmm.
Well, his name was Probst, and he came from Bavaria.
Hmm.
My grandmother's maiden name was Probst, and she came from Bavaria.
Oh,
Who knows?
And
so
yeah, any
maybe a distant
relation?
relation.
Probst was a fairly common German surname, so
Hmm.
it's probably, if they were related, it was probably very distant relations.
Hmm.
But I always took a little pride in that. And well, who knows? Maybe I did have some blood connection with those resistors. But that's pure speculation on my part.
Hmm. So the reason why I bring up the White Rose, and this is a provocative question, feel free
Oh.
to not answer it if you don't want to, but
Okay.
the White Rose and others like them were explicitly nonviolent. They wouldn't even consider killing Hitler or killing anybody else. And what happened to them? They all got killed. So
Right.
what does that say? Do you feel like this says something about the usefulness of nonviolent movements versus
Wow, this
violent
is a
movements?
provocative question, Zach.
Thank you. I know.
Yeah. Well, I personally would be unable to make a generalization on this. Well, I see the various resistance movements in this country today. They are achieving something. This nation, we've got a 400-year history of slavery in this country, and it's changing. The attitudes are changing. the attitudes towards the police are changing because the police behave like a bunch of you-know-what. And on many occasions. Now, a lot of good cops, but there are other cops too. So what I'm saying is that non-violent resistance can be a very good thing under the right circumstances. But when you're in the resistance movements against the Nazis, lots of luck. It's just that even if they had been willing to assassinate Hitler, had they been apprehended, and I'm sure they would have been, they had, what can I say? They just were convenient targets for the Nazis.
I see.
So I personally would not make a generalization on that.
All right.
Martin Luther King was a champion of nonviolence, and he ultimately achieved an awful lot for this country.
Definitely.
Well, yeah, I think the idea is the circumstances are different, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Last question. In reading your book, I was interested that you brought up a lot of both how a lot of the members of Valkyrie, their Christian faith provided that moral backing, and then, but all at the same time, you also talk about how other leaders of the Catholic Church or some other Christian denominations in Germany basically just let things happen as they would. So it's just interesting to me that just confronting both sides of, all right, how these teachings that, were instilled in these officers was what motivated to do that, but at the same time, the leadership of the church failed them.
Well, again, let me point you to the United States of America today. Some of Trump's most ardent supporters were so-called Christians. I'm a practicing Christian myself, but I don't think I have much in common with these people. That's about all I guess I can say.
That's it? Okay. Hope you got your answer, Christian.
I don't think there is an answer. It's just, that's why it was more of an open-ended question of just like, it's interesting to look at that and see just, how the things that people can take from things, basically.
Okay, I think that's about all the time we have.
Appreciate your willingness to talk with me.
Oh, yes, of course. So, again, your book is called Traitors or Patriots, A Story of German Anti-Nazi Resistance. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, pretty much most places you can find books. And, of course, you are Louis Eltscher.
Yes.
Did I pronounce that right?
Louis Eltscher, yes.
Eltscher, okay.
Eltscher.
And, thank you for being on our show and telling us about your book.
I appreciate very much your interest in my book. So
yes, and I would highly recommend it. It was a very good read.
Thank you.
So that was Louis for you. Is that wrong? Is that not how you say his name?
Louis? Yeah, no, it's right. That's right. We just pronounce Georg wrong every time before.
Well, that's why we have him on. We learn stuff. And I know I learned a lot.
Which I really should have known because Captain Von Trapp from The Sound of Music, his name is Georg. And so seeing, George without the E at the end, I should have automatically known. Georg, of course, Georg.
I'm just going to put it down as, well, that's the American pronunciation of the name. So it's not wrong, it's just different.
Is it though? I had to get one in there.
Okay, thank you for joining us. We will see you next week for Zero Dark 30. Another very political, very interesting, very hot takey kind of movie. Until then, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at the Spy-Fi Guys. Until next time, I'm Zach.
And I'm Christian.
And we are the Spy-Fi Guys signing off.
Thank you for listening to the Spy-Fi Guys. If you enjoyed our podcast, please be sure to give us a 5-star rating on iTunes. The theme song from this podcast is Mistake the Getaway by Kevin MacLeod from Incompetech.com. Licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0. Films, books, and television shows reviewed by our podcast are the intellectual property of their respective copyright holders, and no infringement is intended.
This is a personal podcast. Any views, statements, or opinions expressed in this podcast are personal and belong solely to the participants. They do not represent those of people, institutions, or organizations that the participants may or may not be associated with in a professional or personal capacity unless explicitly stated. Any views or opinions are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, or individual.
You can find our podcast on social media at The Spy-Fi Guys on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.